the last stand of the free Bronco Apache. When Geronimo surrendered in 1886, the world believed the Apache Wars had ended. History books closed the chapter on Native America's fiercest warriors. But while thousands celebrated their defeat, a small band of Apache slipped silently into Mexico's Sierra Madre Mountains, where they would continue their fight for another 50 years, until a father's revenge would finally bring their story to its brutal end. Ready to explore more untold stories of Native American history? Subscribe to Histories and Native Tales, and join us as we uncover forgotten chapters of America's past. Through the dense pine forests of Mexico's Sierra Madre Mountains, horses' hooves thunder against rocky ground as a group of ranchers race toward the site of the latest Apache raid. Their leader, Francisco Fimbres, drives his mount harder than the rest, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Something in his gut tells him this raid is different. This time, it's personal. Around a bend in the trail, the group pulls their horses to an abrupt halt. In a small ravine beside the path lies a scene that will haunt Francisco's nightmares for decades to come. His wife Maria's body sprawls awkwardly across blood-soaked rocks, her once blue dress now stained a deep crimson. Deep knife wounds pepper her torso, each strike delivered with calculated precision to ensure maximum suffering. Some cuts are shallow, meant to inflict pain rather than kill. Others plunge deep into vital organs, the final killing blows. Her throat bears the distinctive mark of an Apache warrior knife, a clean slice from ear to ear. Her fingers are mangled, showing how desperately she fought back against her attackers. Francisco stumbles from his horse, his legs barely supporting him as he rushes to his wife's side. His weathered hands hover over her body, afraid to touch, afraid to confirm what he already knows. A keening wail escapes his throat, not the sound of a man, but of a wounded animal. But grief quickly gives way to panic as Francisco's eyes dart frantically around the scene. Where is Geraldo? His 3-year-old son had been riding with Maria. The soft mud around the ravine tells the story. Small boot prints lead away from Maria's body, accompanied by the distinctive moccasin tracks of Apache raiders. They've taken his boy. In the Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains, approximately 100 Apache still lived free in the 1920s, carrying on their traditional way of life, decades after their supposed defeat. The locals called them Bronco Apache, the wild ones, the untamed ones. These weren't just any survivors. They were the cunning ones, the most skilled warriors who had evaded both Spanish cavalry and Comanche raiders through the 1700s. While other tribes fell, they adapted. When Mexican bounty hunters came collecting Apache scalps in the 1800s, paying for men, women, and children alike, these were the ones who melted into the mountains like mist. The Bronco Apache moved through the mountains like spirits in the 1920s. Their presence was felt more than seen. Cattle would vanish from herds without a trace. Supplies would disappear from locked storehouses without any signs of forced entry. Local children grew up with warnings burned into their minds. Never wander too far from home. Never play in the forest alone. The Apache were known to take children when opportunity arose, raising them as their own to replenish their dwindling numbers. At night, strange animal calls would echo through the valleys. Experienced woodsmen would freeze at these sounds, knowing they signaled Apache scouts watching from hidden positions. The raiders were masters of their domain, always observing, always waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Most ranchers accepted these raids as an unavoidable cost of frontier life, lose a few cattle, but never follow the Apache into their mountain strongholds. Those who did pursue them into the high country usually never returned. The Apache knew every cave system, every hidden trail through the treacherous peaks. They could vanish into thin air, leaving frustrated posses to wander in circles until supplies ran low and they were forced to return empty-handed. But as Francisco Fimbres kneels beside his wife's mutilated body on that blood-soaked October morning in 1927, something fundamental shifts in the world. From this moment forward, his life will revolve around two singular purposes: finding his son Geraldo and methodically eliminating every last Bronco Apache in the Sierra Madre. This isn't about justice anymore. This isn't even about revenge. This is about extinction. Prior to Francisco Fimbres discovering his wife's mutilated body and his son missing, The family had been traveling together near their hometown of Nacorichico in Sonora. The journey was meant to be routine. They had made this trip countless times before, along the same mountain trail. They rode 2 horses that morning, Francisco and his young daughter on one mount, while Maria guided another horse carrying 3-year-old Geraldo. The winding path through the Sierra Madre foothills was familiar territory for the Fimbres family. Francisco kept his horse about 30 yards behind Maria's, maintaining a careful distance on the narrow trail. His daughter sat secure in front of him, her small hands gripping the saddle horn as they wound their way through the mountain passes. Each turn and switchback was known to them, including the sharp bend marked by a massive boulder, a landmark that would soon become a monument to their tragedy. As Maria's horse approached the boulder, the peaceful mountain morning shattered into chaos. Witnesses later recounted 2 distinct versions of the attack. Some claimed they heard a rifle shot crack through the canyon, the sound echoing off the rocky walls. In their telling, Maria toppled from her horse while desperately clutching Geraldo, trying to shield him even as she fell. A group of Apache warriors then emerged from behind the boulder, weapons already drawn. Others described a different scene, one of silent, lethal efficiency. In their account, 2 or 3 Apache women, accompanied by a man whose identity would later become significant, materialized from their hiding spots without a sound. They dragged both Maria and Geraldo from the horse in one swift motion, giving them no chance to cry out or resist. Both versions converged on what happened next. The Apache surrounded Maria, their knives glinting in the morning sun. Francisco's hand moved to his weapon. Some accounts mention a revolver, others a rifle, but most agree he was armed. In that moment, time seemed to freeze as he faced the most horrific choice any parent could imagine. The distance between them, 30 yards of exposed trail, might as well have been 30 miles. His daughter's arms tightened around his waist as she began to tremble. The choice before him was impossible: charge forward into what would certainly be death for all 3 of them, or retreat to save at least one child. Every instinct screamed at him to rush to his wife and son's defense, but his daughter's presence forced him to confront a brutal reality. Any rescue attempt would likely end with all 3 of them dead. His daughter's frightened whimper broke through his paralysis. Francisco wheeled his horse around, each of her sobs driving daggers into his heart as they fled. Half a mile down the trail, he found a dense thicket of brush. With shaking hands, he lifted his daughter from the saddle and concealed her there, promising to return quickly. Then he spurred his horse toward Nacorichico, desperate to gather help before it was too late. Their return to the ambush site would haunt Francisco for the rest of his life. Maria's body lay where she had fallen, while Geraldo had vanished into the mountains with his captors. As Francisco organized an immediate pursuit party, an unexpected voice urged him to reconsider his course of action. Lupe, a young Apache woman who had been adopted into Nacorichico as a teenager, approached him with crucial information about his son's captors. Her knowledge of Apache ways led her to believe any rescue attempt would be futile. The warriors would spot them coming long before they could get close enough to succeed. Their mastery of the mountain terrain meant pursuers would be walking into certain death. When Francisco tried to recruit Lupe as a guide, her reaction revealed the depth of her fear. She refused outright, her face showing raw terror at the mere suggestion. Her last encounter with her former people had clearly left deep emotional scars. She was too frightened of what they might do if they recaptured her. Lupe identified the raiders' leader as Apache Juan, a man she described with evident dread. According to her, he was present during Maria's murder, though she didn't specify his exact role in the attack. Her description of him as bad and cruel seemed to barely scratch the surface of his reputation. Instead of pursuit, Lupe proposed a strategy that seemed to go against every paternal instinct. She advised Francisco to take no action at all, to let the Apache believe they had broken his spirit. Her experience told her that if the warriors suspected they were being tracked, they would kill Geraldo simply to discourage further pursuit. This wasn't speculation, she had seen it happen before. However, if the Apache believed themselves safe from retaliation, a different fate awaited Geraldo. Lupe explained that they would likely adopt him as their own, as they had done with dozens of captives over the years. These adopted children often became fully integrated members of the tribe, sometimes rising to positions of importance within the community. Lupe's suggestion to wait, to let the Apache adopt Geraldo and attempt a rescue years later when they had grown attached to him, fell on deaf ears. Francisco's paternal instincts rejected the very notion of abandoning his son to his wife's killers. With the weight of guilt already crushing him for retreating during the attack, inaction was impossible. Over the next 3 years, Francisco launched 8 separate expeditions into the Sierra Madre Mountains. Each venture pushed deeper into Apache territory, but as Lupe had predicted, they found nothing but ghostly traces of their quarry. Empty camps with fires still warm revealed how narrowly they missed their targets. Faint trails led nowhere, disappearing into rocky terrain or dense forest. Francisco adapted his tactics with each failed attempt. His men wore darkened clothes to blend with the shadows and moved in complete silence. They avoided making fires, eating cold rations to prevent smoke from betraying their position. They studied Apache tracking methods, learning to recognize the subtle signs of passage that most eyes would miss. But the Bronco Apache proved too elusive. This failure came as no surprise to those familiar with Apache warfare. During the campaigns of the 1800s, the U.S. military had learned a harsh lesson. Only Apache scouts could successfully track other Apache. They had employed hundreds of native trackers, acknowledging that finding the Bronco in their mountain stronghold required intimate knowledge of their ways. While Francisco continued his relentless search, an American researcher named Grenville Goodwin began documenting the last free Apache. His work, though romanticized, provided valuable insights into how these warriors had survived decades of pursuit. He tracked every newspaper mention of Apache activity and gathered accounts from contacts at reservations like San Carlos. Goodwin even mounted 2 expeditions into Mexico, hoping to make contact with the elusive Bronco. Like so many others, he failed to find them. The research compiled in Goodwin's journals, later published as The Apache Diaries by his son, revealed a complex picture of survival. The Bronco Apache maintained their freedom through a combination of incredible resourcefulness and careful strategy. They could hunt and forage from the mountain environment, but their refusal to establish permanent farms meant they needed to supplement their resources through raids. These raids demonstrated their tactical sophistication. Rather than targeting a single ranch repeatedly, they would take 1 or 2 cattle from different locations, spreading their impact across a wide area. The Apache's reputation for ruthless retaliation convinced most ranchers to accept occasional losses rather than risk escalation. The Bronco's survival strategy extended beyond raiding. Some warriors made clandestine visits to the San Carlos and Mescaleros reservations, where aging relatives provided supplies and information. These encounters, documented through multiple witness accounts, suggested ongoing connections between the free Apache and their reservation-bound kin. Most surprisingly, the Bronco Apache sometimes walked openly through Mexican towns. Many spoke enough Spanish to conduct basic trade. Reports describe discovering Apache camps containing Mexican clothing, suggesting they could blend into local populations when necessary. Their mixed heritage, many being descendants of Apache and Mexican unions, made this infiltration even easier. This ability to move between worlds, to be everywhere and nowhere, made the Bronco Apache nearly impossible to track. They were masters of adaptation, shifting between fierce warriors and peaceful traders as circumstances required. Their intimate knowledge of the Sierra Madre's vast wilderness provided countless hiding places, while their understanding of Mexican society allowed them to gather intelligence and supplies when needed. For Francisco, this adaptability made his search increasingly frustrating. Every lead turned cold, every trail vanished, every promising contact proved fruitless. But each failure only strengthened his resolve. The Apache's very elusiveness, their ability to disappear like smoke, reminded him daily that somewhere in those mountains, his son might still be alive. By 1930, Francisco's relentless search for his son had captured regional attention. Though the Mexican government officially maintained their distance, news of his quest spread north across the border. The Douglas Daily Dispatch began publicizing his cause, drawing eager volunteers from the United States who saw this as their chance to participate in what was being billed as the last Apache hunt. American enthusiasm soon overwhelmed Mexican participation, but this groundswell of foreign support raised alarm in Mexico City. Government officials grew increasingly uneasy about the prospect of armed American militants operating on Mexican soil, especially given that many volunteers openly discussed their interest in rumored mineral deposits, gold, silver, and copper, hidden in the Sierra Madre Mountains. Before the American volunteers could mobilize, Mexican authorities intervened to shut down the operation. The official explanation cited sovereignty concerns, but underlying tensions about foreign prospectors exploiting a rescue mission for potential mining opportunities played a significant role in their decision. Francisco, however, refused to let official opposition deter him. In April 1930, after the Mexican government grounded the American volunteer force, he assembled a smaller group of 12 trusted men from Nacarichico. Acting on reports of Apache activity between their town and Casas Grandes, they ventured into previously unexplored sections of the Sierra Madre. Several days into their expedition, rising smoke from a campfire betrayed Apache presence. The group approached with practiced stealth, their years of failed searches having taught them the value of patience and caution. Through the trees, they spotted 2 Apache women near the fire, seemingly unaware of the approaching danger. The ensuing confrontation unfolded with brutal swiftness. The group's first volley wounded one woman in the arm, prompting her to cry out Nite, the Apache word for Mexicans. Her companion shouted for help, specifically calling out to Apache Juan by name. Before either woman could reach cover, a second volley of shots ended their lives. Other Apache warriors melted into the forest, but Apache Juan, the feared leader Lupe had warned about, chose to make his stand. Despite being heavily outnumbered, he turned to face Francisco's group, firing back to cover his people's retreat. The tactical decision cost him his life. Francisco's men managed to pin him down, while others worked around his position. A flanking shot wounded him before the group moved in to finish what they'd started. In the aftermath, Francisco's men scoured the abandoned camp, collecting saddles, rifles, and various Apache artifacts as souvenirs of their victory. But they made 2 critical errors. First, they took time to search the bodies of their victims. Second, they left those bodies unburied and exposed, a deliberate show of disrespect intended to strike fear into surviving Apache. Francisco believed this display of brutality might finally convince the Apache to release Geraldo. The Arizona Daily Star even published what amounted to a victory photograph, celebrating the death of Apache Juan and his companions. Despite Lupe's earlier warnings about Apache psychology, Francisco had convinced himself that intimidation would succeed where patience had failed. This fundamental misunderstanding of Apache culture would exact the highest possible price. 2 days after the raid, Mexican riders passing through the area detected the smell of decay. Investigation revealed that other Apache had returned to provide proper burial for their dead companions. But alongside these carefully prepared graves lay another, hastily dug and shallow. From this crude hole, Geraldo's legs protruded from the earth, a final message from the Apache to his father. The 7-year-old's body bore clear signs of torture, suggesting his death had not been quick. Francisco's attempt to intimidate the Apache through desecration of their dead had instead sealed his son's fate. Friends who knew Francisco said this discovery broke something fundamental in him. The man who had spent years searching for his son, holding on to hope despite repeated failure, ceased to exist. In his place emerged someone focused solely on revenge. The complex motivations that had driven him before, grief for his wife, hope for his son, guilt over his retreat, distilled into pure hatred. The tragic irony of Francisco's story lay in how his actions had ultimately defeated his purpose. By choosing intimidation over patience, by desecrating Apache dead instead of respecting their customs, he had triggered exactly the response Lupe had warned him about. His son, who might have been adopted and eventually recovered alive, instead became another casualty in a centuries-old cycle of violence. This transformation of Francisco's quest from rescue to revenge marked a dark turn in the region's history. Blood feuds had long characterized relations between settlers and Apache, each act of violence spawning new rounds of retaliation. But this particular cycle carried special weight because it began with Francisco's genuine desire to save his son, rather than simple vengeance for his wife. The roots of this tragedy reached deep into the past. In 1915, a dozen years before Maria's murder and Geraldo's abduction, Francisco joined a group of ranchers pursuing Apache cattle raiders. That pursuit ended with the capture of a young Apache girl, initiating a sequence of vengeance that would consume multiple generations. The captured girl, later baptized as Lupe, spent time in the Fimbres household before another family in Nacori Chico adopted her. During her years among the settlers, she developed an acute awareness that her capture had drawn deadly attention to the town, particularly to the Fimbres family. The feared warrior Apache Juan and her mother maintained constant surveillance of their movements. Years after her capture, Lupe sought permission to return to her people. The community, perhaps seeking redemption, allowed her departure. She successfully located her family in the mountains, only to receive a harsh welcome. Her own people threatened her with death if she ever attempted to return, considering her irreversibly contaminated by her time among the Mexicans. After the 1927 attack on the Fimbres family, this history took on new significance. Lupe, who had cautioned Francisco against pursuing Geraldo, recognized a deliberate pattern in the events. She identified the woman who had attacked Maria as her own mother, carrying out a calculated exchange of children. The ledger of revenge demanded precise balance. Francisco's description of the Apache women killed in his 1930 raid brought Lupe to a heartbreaking conclusion. She believed she had lost both her mother and sister to his vengeance. The cycle of violence between the Broncos and the Fimbres family had completed its circle, spanning nearly 20 years of escalating brutality. Researcher Grenville Goodwin's 1934 assessment suggested only 30 Bronco Apache remained in the Sierra Madre. He derived this figure by analyzing cattle raid patterns and calculating the food requirements for their community. While acknowledging the estimate's limitations, his conclusion proved stark. They are fighting a losing battle in Mexico, and it seems only a question of time till they will be exterminated. The conflict's final phase became obscured by contradictory accounts. Reports from 1933 describe Francisco leading an expedition that claimed 24 Apache lives, while similar incidents from 1932 indicate a much lower casualty count. Both narratives share one somber detail. 3 captured children perished within 12 months of their capture. Accounts from Tucson in September 1934 echo reports from 1935, describing Francisco's group ambushing Apache warriors, forced down from their mountain sanctuaries by heavy snow. While these overlapping narratives blur the line between fact and legend, one pattern emerges clearly. By 1935, all reports of Apache activity in the region ceased. Questions about the Bronco Apache's ultimate fate persisted. Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad's 1937 expedition into the Sierra Madre sought answers, but officially reported no contact. However, his Apache guides, including Llanoza, who had surrendered alongside Geronimo in 1886, later shared a different account with their reservation contacts. During his 1938 visit to the Mescaleros Reservation, Grenville Goodwin uncovered intriguing accounts that challenged the narrative of Apache extinction. 2 separate witnesses described encounters with wild Apache who had visited the reservation the previous year. These mysterious visitors spoke fluent Spanish, suggesting they had maintained regular contact with Mexican settlements while preserving their freedom in the mountains. As decades passed, similar stories emerged across the region. A woman in Colorado shared memories of her parents' origins in a remote settlement west of Chihuahua City. She described a close-knit community where every resident shared blood ties. Most tellingly, she recalled how her parents would speak Apache to their grandchildren, maintaining their ancestral language well into the 1950s, before finally leaving their mountain home. In 1948, anthropologist Tom Hinton documented another remarkable encounter south of Nacorichico. His research led him to a local man who described meeting 4 individuals claiming Apache heritage. These men wore traditional buckskin clothing and moccasins, identifying themselves as descendants of the Chiricahua. Their presence in an area predominantly inhabited by mountain pumas suggested the Apache had found ways to coexist with other Native American communities while maintaining their distinct identity. These accounts point to two possible fates for the surviving Bronco Apache, some likely dispersed across the region, gradually integrating into small Mexican towns and native communities while preserving elements of their culture in secret. Others may have withdrawn deeper into the Sierra Madre's vast wilderness, establishing hidden settlements in areas too remote for outsiders to locate. The Sierra Madre's terrain supports this possibility. The mountain range spans thousands of square miles of rugged, nearly impenetrable wilderness. Narrow canyons, dense forests, and maze-like rock formations create countless natural hideaways. Modern satellite mapping has revealed hundreds of isolated valleys and plateaus capable of sustaining small communities, many of which remain unexplored even today. Reports of Apache sightings continue to surface periodically. Local ranchers describe unexplained movements in the mountains, strange sounds in the night, and livestock disappearing without trace. While many dismiss these accounts as folklore or imagination, they mirror the historical patterns of Apache presence documented throughout their resistance. Modern visitors to the Sierra Madre often report an uncanny sense of being watched. The feeling triggers deep-seated instincts, the same primal awareness that warned Mexican settlers of Apache presence a century ago. In those vast mountains, every unexplained sound or movement raises the possibility that some descendants of the free Apache continue their ancestors' way of life, invisible to the outside world. The legacy of the Bronco Apache endures in the lands they fought to defend. Their saga demonstrates the extraordinary lengths people will go to preserve their freedom, culture, and identity. Even in defeat, they shaped the history of the American Southwest and northern Mexico in ways that continue to influence both regions. Join Histories and Native Tales for more deep dives into forgotten chapters of Native American history. Subscribe now to explore the hidden stories that shaped our continent.